Picture this. Arizona Territory, 1871. The sun beats down like a hammer on an anvil, and Captain Marcus Wheaton tastes that familiar alkaline dust coating his teeth as his cavalry column struggles through Sulphur Springs Valley. The thermometer reads 110 degrees in the shade, 110 degrees, if you can find any shade out here. Their horses are wheezing, foam dripping from their bits, and every man in that column knows they're being watched. Somewhere up there in the Dragoon Mountains, Cochise and 500 Chiricahua Apache warriors are doing exactly what you'd expect, the most formidable light cavalry in North America to do. They're watching and waiting. And Captain Wheaton? He's gripping his Springfield rifle like it's the last solid thing in a world gone liquid with heat and fear. Now, that Springfield rifle, let me tell you about this weapon for a moment. This is cutting-edge military technology for 1871. The Springfield trapdoor rifle can drop a man at 800 yards with authority that would make a modern sniper nod with approval. It's powerful, it's accurate, and it represents the absolute pinnacle of American small arms manufacturing. But here's the catch that every cavalry officer in the Southwest knew by heart. It takes precious seconds to reload. And in those seconds, those few heartbeats where a trooper is fumbling with cartridges and working that trapdoor mechanism, Apache riders can cover 50 yards and disappear into rocky canyons where no cavalry horse can follow. Think about that tactical reality for a moment. You've got this incredibly powerful weapon that can reach out and touch someone from nearly half a mile away, but after you fire it, you might as well be holding an expensive club. Meanwhile, your enemy fights from horseback with traditional weapons and whatever repeating rifles they've captured or traded for, and they've spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of making themselves invisible in terrain that looks like the surface of Mars. This is the story of how one Irish immigrant soldier's desperate innovation would transform American warfare and seal the fate of the Apache Nation. But to understand how we got to that moment in 1871, we need to go back. Way back. 3 centuries earlier, Spanish conquistadors first encountered Apache bands in what we now call the American Southwest. Those conquistadors brought something that would change everything: horses. The Spanish probably thought they were just expanding their empire, but what they actually did was hand the Apache the key to becoming the most formidable light cavalry force on the continent. By 1870, Apache warriors like Victorio and Nana had perfected hit-and-run tactics that made American technological superiority feel like a cruel joke. They could strike a supply convoy, scatter a cavalry patrol, and vanish into landscape that looked empty to European eyes, but held 1,000 hiding places for people who'd grown up reading every rock and shadow. Into this world came James Morrison, who'd fled the Irish potato famine as a boy and found purpose in the American cavalry. Through his letters to his sister Margaret back in Boston, TAT, letters that somehow survived in a trunk in someone's attic until the 1950s, we get a window into what it was actually like to be a frontier soldier. $4 a month. Think about that. $4 a month to ride through country where every boulder might hide a warrior whose grandfather was fighting cavalry before Morrison was born. Hardtack and beans for dinner. Endless drills in desert heat that could kill you just as dead as any Apache arrow. And the constant, gnawing fear that today might be the day your number comes up. But Morrison's letters reveal something else, too. A fascination with the technical aspects of soldiering. A mind that couldn't stop thinking about how things might work better. He writes to Margaret about modifying his equipment, about studying Apache tactics, about the inadequacies of cavalry doctrine written by men who'd never faced mounted archers in broken terrain. Meanwhile, we need to understand the other side of this equation. Apache society was far more complex than the simple, savage warrior stereotype that dominated newspaper accounts back east. Through the memories of Lozan, AMT, Victorio's sister, and a legendary warrior woman whose oral accounts were recorded decades later, we learn how Apache bands lived, loved, and fought to preserve ancestral lands that held not just their homes, but their entire cosmos. Lawson could track a mouse across bare rock, predict weather changes days in advance, and fight with rifle or traditional weapons with equal skill. She moved through a landscape that spoke to her in ways that cavalry officers trained at West Point could never comprehend. Every spring, every hidden canyon, every game trail was part of a geography that went back generations. But by 1871, that traditional world was under pressure like never before. Gold strikes in Tombstone, silver discoveries in the Bradshaw Mountains. Suddenly, every businessman from San Francisco to New York wanted secure transport routes through Apache territory. The mathematics were brutal. Apache resistance meant lost profits, and lost profits meant political pressure on the army to solve the Apache problem once and for all. So there you have it. On one side, you've got Captain Wheaton and his column, equipped with state-of-the-art weapons that reload too slowly and following tactics designed for fighting conventional enemies in conventional terrain. On the other side, you've got Cochise and his warriors, fighting for their homeland with 3 centuries of accumulated tactical wisdom and horses that could navigate terrain no cavalry mount could match. And somewhere in that column, Sergeant James Morrison is thinking about grip angles and loading sequences, completely unaware that his tinkering is about to change the trajectory of American military history. The stage is set for an innovation that will forever change the balance of power in the American Southwest. But first, something has to go wrong. June 15th, 1872. If you want to understand how history turns on a dime, how a single moment of desperate improvisation can echo through the centuries, then you need to picture Sergeant James Morrison leading a patrol through Apache Pass on what started as a routine scout. The morning was deceptively quiet. Morrison had 16 men with him, 2 young troopers mostly, farm boys from Ohio and Pennsylvania, who still flinched at shadows that might be Apache warriors. The kind of men who wrote letters home about how different the desert was from anything they'd ever imagined, how the silence could make your ears ring louder than artillery fire. Then the world exploded. Warriors struck from 3 directions simultaneously, a classic Apache tactic that had been perfected over decades of fighting Spanish, Mexican, and now American forces. Morrison later wrote that it was like watching the landscape itself come alive with hostile intent. One moment they were riding through empty country, the next moment arrows were whistling past their heads and war cries were echoing off canyon walls. Private Thomas McKenna, 19 years old, from a farm outside Cincinnati, caught an arrow through his throat in the first seconds of the attack. Morrison watched him fall, watched the life drain out of a boy who'd joined the army to see the West and send money home to his mother. And in that moment, with McKenna dying in the dust and Apache riders closing from 3 sides, something clicked in Morrison's mind. You have to understand the tactical situation here. Standard cavalry doctrine called for dismounting, forming a defensive line, and delivering volley fire with those Springfield rifles. It was textbook military science, based on decades of experience fighting conventional enemies. But Apache warriors weren't conventional enemies, and this wasn't conventional terrain. Morrison's mind was racing. The Springfield's power meant nothing if you could only fire it once before warriors closed to bow range. The reload sequence: open the breech, extract the spent cartridge, insert a new round, close the breech, cock the hammer, took 6 to 8 seconds for a well-trained soldier. In 6 seconds, a mounted Apache warrior could cover 60 yards and put 3 arrows in the air. So Morrison did something that would have gotten him court-martialed if it hadn't worked. Instead of following doctrine, he altered his grip on the rifle, shifted his stance, and modified his loading sequence in ways that his fingers seemed to know before his brain understood what he was doing. The first shot dropped a warrior at 200 yards, a clean hit that sent the man tumbling from his horse. But instead of the usual scramble to reload, Morrison's hands moved with a fluidity that surprised even him. He'd repositioned his cartridge box, changed how he held the rifle during the loading process, and somehow, he was ready to fire again in half the usual time. The second shot came 4 seconds after the first, then the third, then the fourth. The Apache warriors, expecting the usual cavalry reload delay, rode directly into sustained fire that should have been impossible with single-shot rifles. 3 warriors fell in rapid succession, and the rest wheeled away in confusion. For the first time in Morrison's experience, his patrol had repelled an Apache attack without taking casualties beyond poor McKenna. Word of Morrison's technique spread through the regiment like wildfire. And let me tell you, in the tight-knit world of frontier cavalry, where your life depended on the man next to you knowing his business, news like this travelled fast. Within a week, Morrison was demonstrating his method to Captain Wheaton and a gathering of officers at Fort Huachuca. The training sequences that followed were brutal. Soldiers practiced the new grip until their hands bled, learning to control their horses with their knees while maintaining rapid fire. The muscle memory had to be perfect. In combat, there was no time to think about finger placement or cartridge angles. Captain Wheaton, initially skeptical of any deviation from established doctrine, became Morrison's champion after witnessing a demonstration that left every officer present speechless. Morrison hit 10 targets in 60 seconds from a galloping horse, a feat that should have been impossible with a single-shot rifle. But the Apache weren't standing still either. Through Al-Seba, the legendary Apache scout who walked the dangerous line between two worlds, word filtered back about how the warriors were adapting. They'd noticed the change. That terrible rhythm of Springfield fire had doubled. Tactical councils were being held in hidden camps, new strategies developed to counter what the Apache came to call the fast thunder. The technique faced its first major test at the Battle of Skull Canyon in August 1872. Picture this. 120 cavalrymen using Morrison's method facing 300 Apache warriors led by Nana, Victorio's most trusted lieutenant. Through the dust and gun smoke, 2 very different ways of understanding warfare were about to collide. Corporal Patrick O'Brien, an Irish immigrant like Morrison, left us a detailed account of that engagement. He wrote about the strange confidence that came with knowing you could fire twice as fast as the enemy expected, about watching Apache warriors fall in numbers that seemed impossible with the weapons they thought they were facing. But we also have the Apache perspective, preserved in the oral accounts of Kay Wakeler, who fought at Skull Canyon as a young warrior. He described the shock of facing guns that spoke like angry spirits, the confusion as tactics that had worked for generations suddenly proved inadequate. When the smoke cleared, 42 Apache warriors lay dead. Only 6 cavalrymen had been wounded. It was a tactical revolution disguised as a minor engagement in a forgotten canyon. News of the victory reached Washington within 2 weeks, carried by telegraph wires that now stretched across the continent. President Ulysses Grant, a man who understood the mathematics of warfare better than most, demanded that Morrison's technique be taught throughout the Western cavalry. Orders went out to every frontier post. This Irish sergeant's innovation was now official doctrine, but in Apache camps scattered across the Southwest, leaders like Geronimo were already developing counter-tactics. The cycle of innovation and adaptation that would drench the Southwest in blood was just beginning. The thunder of Morrison's rifles had spoken, and the lightning of Apache response was about to answer. The years 1873 through 1882 would witness the bloodiest chapter of the Apache Wars, as Morrison's technique transformed from battlefield innovation to the standard doctrine that would determine the fate of nations. But every great historical transformation has a human cost, and the price of this particular innovation would be measured in blood across the sacred mountains of the Southwest. At Fort Apache, Morrison himself became something he'd never expected to be: a teacher. The Army established specialized rifle schools where the Irish sergeant who'd improvised a technique in desperate combat now trained officers from across the frontier. Picture him there in the desert heat, demonstrating grip angles and reload sequences to lieutenants fresh from West Point, men who'd studied European warfare, but had never faced an enemy who could vanish into landscape that looked empty to civilized eyes. But this story isn't just about tactics and training. It's about 3 lives caught in the machinery of history, 3 people whose stories illuminate the terrible complexity of what was happening in the Southwest. First, Lieutenant James Watson, 24 years old, from a good Boston family that expected their son to distinguish himself in military service. Watson mastered Morrison's technique with an aptitude that impressed even Morrison himself. He could put 10 rounds on target in under 2 minutes from horseback. 2024. Marksmanship that would have made him legendary in any conventional war. But Watson's letters home tell a different story. He wrote about nightmares, about the faces of Apache women and children caught in crossfire, about the sound Morrison's rapid fire made when it found human targets. "The technique works too well," he wrote to his father in the spring of 1876. "We've become so efficient at killing that I fear we've lost track of what we're killing for." Second, there was Loco, an Apache leader trying to navigate an impossible situation. Loco wasn't a war chief like Victorio or Geronimo. He was what we might call a moderate, a man who understood that accommodation with the Americans might be the only path to survival for his people. Through the accounts of Apache oral historians recorded decades later, we see Loco's desperate attempts to keep his band neutral, while pressure mounted from both American forces, armed with Morrison's innovation, and militant Apache factions who viewed any cooperation as betrayal. Third, Maria Gonzalez, whose family had run cattle on a small ranch between Fort Apache and the Mogollon Mountains for 3 generations. The Gonzalez family existed in that dangerous middle ground between 2 forces, trying to maintain their way of life while the world tore itself apart around them. Maria's diary, discovered in the ruins of the ranch house in 1923, provides a civilian perspective on how Morrison's tactical revolution affected ordinary people caught between armies. The human cost mounted through escalating encounters that demonstrated the technique's devastating effectiveness. At Sibeque Creek in August 1881, tensions exploded when Apache medicine man Noke de Kliner was killed during an arrest attempt. The medicine man had been preaching a new religion that promised the return of dead warriors and the disappearance of white settlers, the kind of spiritual movement that emerges when a people face extinction. The fight at Sibeque Creek showed how Morrison's technique had changed the tactical balance. Apache warriors who might have successfully ambushed a cavalry patrol using traditional fire and movement tactics found themselves facing sustained fire that cut down men and horses with mechanical precision. The rapid fire didn't just kill warriors, it broke the rhythm of Apache warfare itself. But the technique's most terrible demonstration came during Victorio's desperate campaign through New Mexico in 1879 and 1880. Victorio, Loco's war chief brother and one of the most brilliant tactical minds the Apache ever produced, understood exactly what Morrison's innovation meant for his people. Apache warfare depended on mobility, on the ability to strike hard and disappear before enemy forces could respond effectively. Morrison-trained cavalry units began systematically denying Victorio's band access to water sources, ECA, a strategy that would have been impossible without the rapid-fire capability that allowed smaller cavalry forces to hold defensive positions against larger Apache groups. Picture the mathematics of desperation. Horses and humans can survive 3 days without water in desert heat. Morrison's technique meant that cavalry forces could now control water sources with the kind of firepower density that made Apache attacks suicidal. The pivotal engagement came at the Battle of Big Dry Wash in July 1882. 5 troops of cavalry using Morrison's technique trapped Nana's band in a canyon system that should have provided perfect defensive terrain for Apache warriors. But rapid rifle fire from multiple positions turned the canyon into a killing ground. 2 hours of fighting, 54 Apache warriors dead. The cavalry suffered 3 wounded. Through captured Apache accounts and cavalry diaries, we can see how completely the technique had changed frontier warfare. Apache bands could no longer rely on traditional tactics that had worked for generations. The mathematics of combat had shifted in ways that made their ancestral military wisdom obsolete. Some bands, like those led by Chateau, chose surrender and reservation life rather than face the certainty of annihilation. Others, like Geronimo's Chiricahua, fled to Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains, launching cross-border raids that would strain international relations and keep Morrison's innovation at the center of military strategy. By 1883, fewer than 50 hostile Apache remained free in the field. But their raids terrorized thousands of square miles, and every ranch burned, every wagon train attacked, every isolated settlement struck meant that Morrison's technique remained the Army's primary tactical advantage. Lieutenant Watson, the young officer who'd mastered the technique so completely, requested transfer to a desk position in San Francisco in 1883. His final report on Apache tactics concluded with words that would prove prophetic. "We have developed a method of warfare so effective that it threatens to make warfare itself obsolete. The question remains whether this is progress or catastrophe." The blood moon was setting over the sacred mountains, and with it, a way of life that had endured for centuries was coming to an end. September 4th, 1886. Picture the scene at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona Territory. Geronimo, the last free Apache war leader, rides into General Nelson Miles' camp with 16 warriors, 14 women, and 6 children, all that remained of the once mighty Chiricahua Nation. The surrender ceremony itself took less than an hour, but it marked the end of 3 centuries of Apache resistance and the final validation of an innovation born in desperate combat 14 years earlier. 2,000 miles away at Fort Riley, Kansas, Master Sergeant James Morrison was training recruits in cavalry tactics when word of Geronimo's surrender reached the post. Morrison received a commendation that day, 10 official recognition he'd never sought, for an innovation he'd developed in a moment when death seemed certain and conventional wisdom meant suicide. But here's what makes this story so fascinating from a historical perspective. Morrison had no idea what he'd actually accomplished. He thought he'd discovered a better way to reload a rifle. What he'd actually done was pioneer the principle of mobile firepower that would reshape military thinking for the next century. Through military records and training manuals, we can trace how Morrison's technique influenced American cavalry doctrine far beyond the Apache Wars. When American forces fought in the Spanish-American War, cavalry units trained in Morrison's rapid-fire methods proved devastatingly effective in the Philippine insurgency. The principle he'd discovered, that sustained fire from mobile platforms could neutralize numerically superior enemies, became fundamental to American military doctrine. General John J. Pershing, who'd served as a young lieutenant in Apache country during the final campaigns, carried Morrison's insights into the mechanized warfare of the 20th century. Tank tactics, close air support, even the combined arms doctrine that would dominate World War II, all traced intellectual lineage back to an Irish immigrant sergeant who'd modified his grip on a Springfield rifle during an Apache ambush. But let's talk about Morrison himself. because the man who changed history struggled with demons that his innovation couldn't defeat. Through pension records, medical reports, and rare newspaper interviews, we see a different side of our accidental military genius. Morrison battled alcoholism for the final 20 years of his life, haunted by memories of Apache warriors falling to his rapid fire, troubled by nightmares of battles that had made him famous and left him broken. He died in 1893 in a veterans' home outside Topeka, Kansas, forgotten by a nation that had moved on to new wars and new innovations. The obituary in the Topeka Daily Capital ran 3 lines. James Morrison, 71, former cavalry sergeant, died Tuesday of liver complications, survived by a sister in Boston, services pending. No mention of the technique that had changed American warfare. No recognition of the man who'd helped end the Apache Wars. Just another old soldier dying alone, carrying secrets that had shaped the destiny of nations. The technique's true legacy emerged decades later, through examination of military training manuals and tactical doctrine. Morrison's innovation influenced everything from Pershing's expedition against Pancho Villa to early mechanized warfare doctrine. The principle of mobile firepower he'd pioneered accidentally became foundational to 20th century military science. But there's another side to this legacy, one that remained largely silent until Apache voices began speaking in the 1930s through oral history projects conducted by ethnographers and sympathetic historians. These accounts, recorded on primitive wire recorders and later transcribed, revealed how Morrison's innovation was remembered by those who'd faced it. An Apache elder named Daklugi, nephew of Geronimo himself, described Morrison's technique as the moment our traditional way of life became impossible. He spoke of how Apache warriors had adapted to Spanish firearms, Mexican artillery, and American cavalry charges, but couldn't develop effective counters to sustained rapid fire from mobile platforms. The fast thunder, he called it, broke the rhythm of our warfare. These oral histories provide crucial perspective on the human cost of tactical innovation. Apache accounts describe not just military defeats, but the psychological impact of facing weapons that seem to violate the natural order of combat. Traditional Apache warfare was built on movement, surprise, and the exploitation of terrain advantages. Morrison's technique neutralized all 3. The story comes full circle in modern times through an extraordinary meeting that took place in 1987. Dr. Michael Morrison, James Morrison's great-grandson and a military historian at the University of Arizona, arranged to meet with descendants of Apache warriors at the site of Big Dry Wash. The group included elderly Apache men whose grandfathers had fought in the final campaigns, and together they walked the battlefield where Morrison's innovation had proven so devastatingly effective. The conversations that emerged from that meeting, recorded for the Smithsonian Institution's Oral History Project, grapple with the complex legacy of military innovation. Dr. Morrison spoke of struggling with his ancestors' role in destroying Apache culture, while Apache elder Thomas Males reflected on how individual innovations can reshape history in ways their creators never imagine. "Your great-grandfather was a soldier doing his job," Males told Morrison as they stood overlooking the canyon where 54 Apache warriors had died in 1882. He couldn't have known that changing how he loaded his rifle would help end our world. But that's how history works. Small changes have large consequences. The dialogue between Morrison's descendant and Apache elders revealed something profound about the nature of historical memory. Both sides acknowledged courage, innovation, and humanity in their ancestors. Both recognized that in the crucible of conflict, individual acts of survival and ingenuity can have consequences that echo across generations. The narrative concludes with both groups placing memorial stones at Skull Canyon, where Morrison's technique was first tested in major combat. The stones bear no names, no dates, no claims of victory or defeat. They simply acknowledge that here, in this forgotten place, people fought and died and changed the course of history. Thunder no longer echoes across these canyons, but the memory of those who fought and died here speaks to eternal questions about progress, survival, and the price of change. Sometimes history turns on a rifle shot. Sometimes the future is determined by how quickly a desperate man can reload.